Officer Rachel Torres had always believed that fate brought her and Kaiser together on that rainy Tuesday morning 3 years ago. She remembered walking into the Detroit Police Department's K-9 training facility, her heart still heavy from her recent divorce and the bruises on her arms barely healed from her ex-husband's final violent outburst. The facility was buzzing with activity, dozens of German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois, and Dutch Shepherds barking and training with their potential handlers. But Kaiser was different. While the other dogs were actively engaging with trainers, this magnificent black and tan German Shepherd sat quietly in the corner of his kennel, his intelligent amber eyes studying every person who passed by. When Rachel approached his cage, something extraordinary happened. Kaiser stood up slowly, walked to the front of the kennel, and placed his massive paw against the chain-link fence, exactly where Rachel had placed her hand. Their eyes met, and Rachel felt an immediate connection she couldn't explain, as if they were meant to find each other. "That one's been returned 3 times, said Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, the gruff K-9 unit supervisor. "Too protective," they said. "Won't work with male handlers, and he's aggressive toward anyone he perceives as a threat to his assigned officer. Most dogs are loyal, but Kaiser here, he's something else entirely. Almost human in his emotional intelligence." Rachel didn't hesitate. "I'll take him." The first few weeks were challenging, but magical. Kaiser seemed to understand that Rachel had been hurt before, and his protective instincts kicked into overdrive. During training exercises, if any male officer raised his voice or made sudden movements around Rachel, Kaiser would position himself between them, his body language making it clear that he was watching. But it wasn't just protection. It was intuition. Kaiser could sense Rachel's panic attacks before she even realized they were coming, gently nudging her hand or resting his head on her lap until her breathing steadied. Their first real test came during a drug raid in Detroit's notorious Corktown district. Intelligence had indicated that the Morales cartel was using an abandoned factory as a distribution center. As Rachel and Kaiser approached the building, her heart was pounding with nervous energy. This was her first major operation since joining the narcotics division, and failure wasn't an option. Kaiser's nose twitched as they entered the building. He immediately alerted to multiple locations throughout the facility, hidden compartments in the walls, false floors, even a sophisticated tunnel system that led to the adjacent building. But what happened next cemented their legendary partnership. Status. As they were clearing the upper floor, 3 armed cartel members ambushed them from a concealed room. Without hesitation, Kaiser launched himself at the first gunman, his 85-pound frame taking the man down instantly. The second gunman turned his weapon toward Rachel, but Kaiser was already moving. He took 2 bullets in his shoulder and leg butt. Never stopped. His powerful jaws clamped down on the gunman's wrist, forcing him to drop the weapon. Rachel was able to apprehend all 3 suspects, while Kaiser, despite bleeding profusely, refused to leave her side until backup arrived. The veterinary surgeon later said it was miraculous that Kaiser survived. The bullets had missed major arteries by millimeters, but the recovery was long and painful. Rachel took emergency leave to stay by his side, sleeping on the floor of the veterinary hospital for 2 weeks. During Kaiser's darkest moments, when infection set in and his temperature spiked dangerously high, Rachel whispered to him constantly, telling him stories about all the criminals they were going to catch together, all the lives they were going to save. When Kaiser finally opened his eyes and weakly licked Rachel's hand, both of them were crying tears of relief, of gratitude, of an unbreakable bond forged in crisis. From that day forward, their partnership became the stuff of legend in the Detroit Police Department. Their success rate was unprecedented. Kaiser's drug detection abilities were so accurate that defense attorneys began challenging his alerts in court, claiming no dog could be that precise. But Kaiser was that precise. He could detect drugs hidden in false compartments that even experienced human searchers missed. He could sense the residue of narcotics on clothing days after contact. Most remarkably, he seemed to be able to distinguish between different types of drugs, alerting differently for cocaine versus heroin versus marijuana. But their partnership extended far beyond work. Every evening, Rachel would come home to her small apartment, and Kaiser would greet her at the door as if she'd been gone for months instead of hours. He had his own bed, but every night, without fail, he would lie down beside Rachel's bed, his head resting on his paws, watching over her as she slept. Rachel's nightmares from her abusive marriage had plagued her for years, causing her to wake up screaming and drenched in sweat. But with Kaiser there, the nightmares became less frequent and less intense. If she did wake up in distress, Kaiser would immediately be there, his warm body pressed against hers, his steady breathing helping to regulate her own panicked gasps. The most telling moment of their bond came 6 months before everything fell apart. Rachel's ex-husband, Marcus, had been drinking again and showed up at her apartment, demanding to work things out. When Rachel refused to let him in, Marcus became violent, pounding on the door and shouting threats. Kaiser had been sleeping peacefully, but the moment he heard the aggression in Marcus's voice, he transformed. His protective instincts activated with an intensity Rachel had never seen before. When Marcus tried to force his way through the door, Kaiser's growl was so deep and menacing that it seemed to come from somewhere primal and ancient. Marcus took one look at the 85-pound German shepherd baring his teeth and fled immediately. He never bothered Rachel again. You know what I think? Rachel would often tell her fellow officers, scratching behind Kaiser's ears as he leaned into her affectionately. I think Kaiser isn't just my partner, he's my guardian angel. Like God knew I needed someone to watch over me, and he sent me the best protector he had available. Little did Rachel know how prophetic those words would prove to be, and how Kaiser's unwavering loyalty would become her only hope when the entire world turned against her. Detective Mark Stevens had been watching Rachel Torres for 8 months, and his obsession had grown from professional jealousy into something much darker and more dangerous. It started innocently enough. He was simply attracted to the beautiful Latina officer with her infectious laugh and obvious dedication to the job. But when he asked her out for drinks after a successful drug bust, Rachel's polite but firm rejection stung more than he cared to admit. I don't date fellow officers, Mark. It's just a personal rule, she had said with that gentle smile that made his chest tighten. Besides, Kaiser gets jealous when I spend too much time with other guys. She was joking, of course, but Mark saw the way that damn dog positioned himself between them whenever he tried to get close to Rachel. It was as if the German shepherd could sense his intentions and disapproved. The rejection might have been the end of it for a normal person, but Mark Stevens was far from normal. For 15 years, Mark had been a decorated detective in the Detroit Police Department's narcotics division. He'd received commendations, solved high-profile cases, and earned the respect of his peers. But underneath his professional exterior, Mark harbored a toxic combination of narcissism, entitlement, and barely controlled rage that had been simmering for years. His ex-wife had left him 2 years earlier, taking their daughter and half his assets. His gambling addiction had spiraled out of control, leaving him drowning in debt to some very dangerous people. The first time Mark skimmed money from a drug bust, it was supposed to be a one-time thing, just enough to pay off his immediate debts and get the loan sharks off his back. But 1 time became 2 times, and 2 became a regular pattern. Within 6 months, Mark was systematically stealing thousands of dollars from seized drug money, falsifying evidence reports, and even selling confiscated drugs back to street dealers through intermediaries. The money helped with his gambling debts, but it created a much bigger problem. Mark was now completely compromised. If anyone discovered his crimes, he wasn't just looking at losing his job and pension. He was looking at 20 years in federal prison, and worse, some very violent people who had been counting on his protection would want him dead. That's when Rachel became a threat she never knew she was. Rachel's success rate with Kaiser was drawing attention from higher-ups in the department. Internal Affairs had noticed that drug busts involving Rachel and Kaiser resulted in significantly higher seizures on both drugs and cash than other teams. What they didn't realize was that Rachel was actually finding the drugs and money that Mark and others were supposed to find, but hadn't, because they were busy covering their own tracks. The breaking point came on a cold December morning when Captain Williams called Rachel into his office for what she thought was a routine performance review. Instead, she found herself being asked pointed questions about discrepancies in evidence. Reports from recent busts. "I'm not suggesting any wrongdoing, Torres," Captain Williams said, his nervous energy making him pace behind his desk. "But Internal Affairs is asking questions about why your seizure rates are so much higher than your colleagues. They want to know if you're following proper procedures." Rachel was confused, but not alarmed. "Kaiser is just exceptionally good at his job, Captain. We've been training together for 3 years, and he's learned to detect things other dogs miss." What Rachel didn't know was that Captain Williams was also part of Mark's corruption network. Her success was making them all look bad by comparison, and worse, it was drawing exactly the kind of scrutiny they couldn't afford. After Rachel left his office, Williams immediately called Mark. "She's becoming a problem, Stevens. IA is starting to ask questions. If they dig too deep—" "I know," Mark replied, his mind already working on a solution. "Don't worry, I'll handle it." Mark's plan was diabolically simple and terrifyingly effective. He knew that Carlos Vega, one of Detroit's most powerful drug lords, had been under FEDERAL surveillance for months. He also knew that Vega's younger brother, Tony, had been secretly feeding information to the DE in exchange for immunity. What Tony didn't know was that Mark had discovered his cooperation and had been feeding false information back to the cartel through carefully orchestrated leaks. On the night of February 15th, Mark lured Tony to an abandoned warehouse in Detroit's industrial district with promises of a big score. Instead, Tony found himself staring down the barrel of Mark's service weapon. The young man's last words were a desperate plea for his life, but Mark was beyond caring. He'd crossed too many lines to turn back now. But killing Tony was only the first part of Mark's plan. The second part required destroying Rachel Torres completely. Mark had been planning this for weeks, studying Rachel's patterns, learning her schedule, and most importantly, stealing her backup service weapon from her locker during a shift change. He'd practiced Rachel's signature until he could forge it perfectly, and he'd created a false paper trail suggesting secret meetings between Rachel and cartel members. At 11:47 p.m., Mark called Rachel's cell phone, disguising his voice and claiming to be a confidential informant with urgent information about a major drug shipment arriving that night. "You need to come alone, Officer Torres," the disguised voice said. "If they see multiple cops, they'll scatter." The warehouse at 2847 Industrial Boulevard. "They've got enough product to supply the entire east side." Rachel hesitated. Protocol dictated that she should call for backup, but the informant was insistent that any visible police presence would ruin months of careful surveillance. Against her better judgment, she decided to conduct preliminary reconnaissance alone, planning to call for backup once she confirmed the intel. Kaiser sensed her tension as they drove through the dark Detroit streets. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by restless energy, and he kept looking at Rachel with those intelligent amber eyes as if trying to communicate something important. Dogs have an uncanny ability to sense danger, and Kaiser's instincts were screaming that something was terribly wrong. As they pulled up to the warehouse, Rachel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February cold. The building was completely dark, and there were no signs of the activity her informant had described. Kaiser's growl was low and continuous, a warning Rachel should have heeded. But it was too late. Mark Stevens was already inside, waiting beside Tony Viga's cooling corpse, Rachel's backup weapon placed carefully in the dead man's hand to ensure her fingerprints would be on it. The trap was set, and in less than 10 minutes, Rachel's entire life would be destroyed forever. The moment Rachel stepped into the warehouse, Kaiser's behavior changed dramatically. His ears flattened against his head, his hackles rose, and a low, continuous growl rumbled from deep in his chest. In 3 years of partnership, Rachel had never seen him react this way to a crime scene. But before she could process what his warning meant, the warehouse erupted in blinding white light as SWAT team floodlights illuminated the building. "Detroit police, drop your weapon. Get on the ground now." Rachel's mind reeled in confusion. She wasn't holding a weapon. Her service pistol was still holstered. But as her eyes adjusted to the harsh light, she saw Tony Viga's lifeless body, sprawled on the concrete floor, a pool of blood beneath his head. And clutched in his dead hand was a gun that looked exactly like her backup weapon. "There must be some mistake," Rachel shouted over the chaos, raising her hands as red laser dots danced across her chest. "I just got here. I didn't shoot anyone." But Mark Stevens was already inside the warehouse, playing his role perfectly. "Jesus Christ, Rachel," he said, his voice heavy with manufactured disappointment. "What have you done?" Kaiser positioned himself between Rachel and the approaching SWAT officers, his protective instincts overriding his training. He could sense the deception saturating the air, the scent of lies and betrayal that humans couldn't detect. His agitation grew as more officers surrounded them, their intentions clearly hostile toward his beloved partner. "I called it in as soon as I heard the gunshot." Mark continued his performance, addressing the SWAT commander while avoiding Rachel's shocked gaze. "I've been following up on intel about Torres's possible involvement with the Viga cartel. I never wanted to believe it, but the evidence has been mounting for weeks." "That's insane," Rachel protested, her voice cracking with disbelief. "Mark, you know me. You know I would never." "The gun in the victim's hand has your fingerprints on it, Torres," Lieutenant Sarah Brady said grimly as she approached with evidence bags. "Your backup weapon, registered to you, ballistics will confirm it's the murder weapon." Rachel's legs nearly gave out. Her backup weapon? She frantically tried to remember when she'd last seen it. Her locker had been broken into 2 weeks ago, but nothing seemed to be missing. Now she realized Mark must have taken it then, planning this moment with terrifying precision. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Kaiser's distress reached a breaking point. The massive German shepherd began barking frantically, a sound of pure anguish that echoed through the warehouse. He tried to follow Rachel as she was led away, but officers held him back with restraining poles, his powerful body straining against their control. "Kaiser, stay," Rachel commanded through her tears, knowing that if he attacked the officers, they might shoot him. "Good boy, stay calm. I'll be back, I promise." But Kaiser understood more than anyone realized. Dogs can smell fear, deception, and emotional distress in ways humans never could. He could smell Mark's satisfaction, mixed with nervous sweat, the metallic scent of planted evidence, the lingering odor of gunpowder on Mark's hands, despite his claims of arriving after the shooting. Kaiser knew his partner was innocent, but he had no way to communicate this truth to the humans destroying her life. The Wayne County Prosecutor's Office moved with unprecedented speed to bring charges against Rachel. District Attorney Margaret Foster saw the case as a career-making opportunity. A corrupt cop who murdered an informant made for perfect headlines and political advancement. "This is an open and shut case," Foster announced at a press conference the morning after Rachel's arrest. Officer Rachel Torres betrayed her oath, betrayed her community, and committed cold-blooded murder to protect her drug trafficking operation. The people of Detroit deserve justice, and I intend to seek the death penalty. Rachel's court-appointed attorney, David Martinez, was well-meaning but overwhelmed. He'd handled mostly minor drug cases and property crimes, nothing approaching the complexity and media attention of a capital murder case involving a police officer. The evidence against Rachel seemed insurmountable: her weapon, her fingerprints, testimony from fellow officers about her suspicious behavior, even fabricated bank records showing large cash deposits that Mark had created using stolen evidence. Money. But the most damaging testimony came from her own colleagues. Mark Stevens took the witness stand with tears in his eyes, delivering a performance worthy of an Academy Award. Rachel Torres was like a sister to me, he testified, his voice breaking with manufactured emotion. That's what makes this so devastating. For months, I noticed changes in her behavior. She was secretive about her investigations, often working alone, avoiding standard protocols. When I tried to question her about discrepancies in evidence reports, she became hostile and defensive. The lies came easily to Mark, each one carefully crafted to destroy Rachel's credibility. He testified about conversations that never happened, meetings that were pure fiction, evidence of corruption that existed only in his twisted imagination. Captain Williams corroborated Mark's testimony, adding his own fabricated details about Rachel's alleged misconduct. Even officers who barely knew Rachel were coached to remember suspicious behavior, their false memories reinforced by suggestion and repetition. Meanwhile, Kaiser's condition deteriorated rapidly. Removed from active duty and placed in the police kennel facility, he refused to work with any other handler. He barely ate, despite the staff's best efforts to tempt him with his favorite foods. The veterinary staff had never seen such severe depression in a working dog. Dr. Emily Chun, the department's consulting animal behaviorist, was baffled by Kaiser's reaction. In cases where officers are guilty of violent crimes, we typically see dogs withdraw emotionally from their handlers, she explained to the kennel supervisor. They sense the change in their partner's emotional state and often refuse to maintain the same level of attachment. But Kaiser's behavior suggests something entirely different. He's exhibiting signs of grief, typically associated with the death of a handler, not rejection or fear. But Dr. Chun's observations were dismissed by department leadership, who were eager to distance themselves from the scandal. Kaiser became a living reminder of their fallen officer's alleged crimes. An inconvenient witness whose loyalty was now seen as evidence of his poor judgment rather than Rachel's innocence. As the trial date approached, Rachel sat in her jail cell, staring at the concrete walls and trying to understand how her life had been destroyed so completely. The woman who had once been Detroit's most celebrated canine officer was now facing death row, abandoned by the department she'd served faithfully, betrayed by colleagues she'd trusted with her life. The only comfort she had was knowing that somewhere across the city, Kaiser was waiting for her return. His unwavering loyalty, the only proof of her innocence in a world that had already decided she was guilty. The Wayne County Courthouse had never seen anything like it. For 6 grueling months, Rachel Torres's trial had captivated the nation, dividing public opinion between those who believed in her guilt and a growing number who sensed something was terribly wrong with the case. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs reading, "Justice for Tony Vega," while counter-protesters demanded, "Free Rachel Torres." The media circus was unprecedented, with news trucks from every major network lining the streets. Inside courtroom 4A, the tension was suffocating as Judge Harrison Maxwell prepared to deliver the verdict. Rachel sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She'd lost 30 pounds during the trial, her once vibrant appearance now gaunt and hollow. Her court-appointed attorney, David Martinez, had done his best with an impossible case, but the mountain of fabricated evidence had proven insurmountable. The jury had deliberated for only 18 hours, remarkably quick for a capital murder case. When they filed back into the courtroom, none of them would meet Rachel's eyes. The foreman, a retired auto worker named James Peterson, stood with a trembling piece of paper in his hands. On the count of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Rachel's mother, Maria Torres, collapsed. In the gallery, her anguished wails piercing the chaos. Reporters frantically scribbled notes, while news cameras captured every moment of the dramatic scene. Rachel herself sat in stunned silence, the words hitting her like physical blows. Guilty. After everything she'd sacrificed for justice. After all the criminals she'd helped put away, she was now branded as one of them. Judge Maxwell banged his gavel repeatedly, struggling to restore order. The court will now proceed to sentencing. Given the severity of this crime, a police officer murdering an informant to protect a drug trafficking operation, and considering the defendant's complete lack of remorse, this court has no choice but to impose the ultimate penalty. Rachel finally found her voice. Your Honor, I maintain my innocence. I have never... The defendant will remain silent, Maxwell interrupted harshly. Rachel Torres, you are hereby sentenced to death by lethal injection. You will be transferred immediately to the Huron Valley Correctional Facility to await execution. May God have mercy on your soul. The gavel's final bang seemed to echo forever. Rachel's legs gave out completely, and she would have collapsed if not for the bailiff's firm grip on her arm. The woman who had once been Detroit's most decorated canine officer was now officially condemned to die. But the most shocking moment was yet to come. As a special concession to the media, and against all normal protocol, the court had agreed to allow Kaiser one final goodbye with his handler before her transfer to death row. The decision had been controversial, with some calling it a publicity stunt, but public pressure and a petition signed by over 100,000 animal lovers had swayed the judge. Kaiser hadn't seen Rachel in 6 months. During that time, he'd been housed at the Detroit Animal Care Facility, where his condition had deteriorated dramatically. The once proud police dog now weighed 20 pounds less than his optimal weight. His coat had lost its luster, and his eyes held a sadness that broke the hearts of everyone who saw him. When Officer Janet Sullivan led Kaiser into the courthouse hallway, where Rachel waited in shackles, something extraordinary happened. Kaiser, who had been lethargic and unresponsive for months, suddenly came alive. His head snapped up, his ears perked forward, and a sound escaped him that witnesses would later describe as almost human, a whimper of pure joy mixed with desperate longing. The moment Rachel said his name, Kaiser broke free from Officer Sullivan's grip with a strength that seemed impossible for his weakened state. The 90-pound German shepherd launched himself across the hallway, his powerful body moving with the fluid grace that had made him legendary on the force. When Kaiser reached Rachel, he reared up on his hind legs and placed his massive paws on her shoulders, just as he'd done countless times before during their partnership. But this time was different. This time, Kaiser seemed to understand the finality of the moment. His amber eyes locked onto Rachel's face, and he began to whimper, a sound so heartbreaking that several of the watching officers had to turn away. "I know, boy," Rachel whispered, her voice thick with tears. "I know. You don't understand. I don't understand either." Kaiser's response was what made headlines around the world. He pressed his forehead against Rachel's, a gesture of intimacy and trust that he'd never shown with any other human. Then, as if he could sense that this was goodbye forever, he threw back his head and howled a long, mournful sound that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. The howl went on for nearly 30 seconds, echoing through the courthouse corridors. Court reporters would later describe it as the most haunting sound they'd ever heard. Security cameras captured every moment, and within hours, the footage was viral across every social media platform. But Kaiser wasn't finished. As guards moved to separate them, he wrapped his powerful front legs around Rachel's waist in what could only be described as an embrace. He held on with desperate strength, his entire body trembling with the effort to stay connected to his beloved partner. "Kaiser, no," Rachel sobbed, knowing that if he resisted too much, the guards might use force. "You have to let go, boy. You have to be strong." It took 4 corrections officers to finally pry Kaiser away from Rachel. As they carried him down the hallway, his eyes never left her face. Even as the distance between them grew, Kaiser continued to cry out, his voice echoing off the marble walls like a lament for justice itself. The footage of their separation became one of the most viewed videos in internet history. Animal behaviorists around the world analyzed Kaiser's reactions, with many concluding that his behavior was inconsistent with a handler guilty of violent crimes. Dr. Patricia Williams, a renowned expert in canine psychology from Cornell University, appeared on national television to explain the significance. "Dogs cannot be fooled by human deception," she stated emphatically. If Rachel Torres were truly guilty of cold-blooded murder, Kaiser would sense the change in her emotional and psychological state. The fact that he maintains such desperate loyalty and grief suggests he knows something the court system has missed. The hashtag Kaiser Knows began trending worldwide, with millions sharing the video and questioning Rachel's conviction. Celebrity activists, animal rights organizations, and legal scholars began calling for a review of the case. But in the American justice system, viral videos and public opinion couldn't overturn a jury's verdict. As Rachel was transported to death row in a heavily armored vehicle, she pressed her face against the small window and watched Detroit's skyline disappear. Somewhere in that city, Kaiser was grieving for her, his unwavering loyalty the only evidence of her innocence in a world that had condemned her to die. The Huron Valley Correctional Facility's death row was designed to break the human spirit, and for most inmates, it succeeded. The isolation was complete 23 hours a day in a concrete cell measuring 8 by 10 feet, with 1 hour of recreation in a slightly larger concrete cage. But Rachel Torres wasn't most inmates. Within days of her arrival, she had become the most famous condemned prisoner in America, and possibly the world. Cell Block H housed Michigan's 15 death row inmates, but none had ever generated the kind of attention that followed Rachel. Letters arrived by the thousands, some expressing hatred and calls for swift execution, but increasingly, messages of support and belief in her innocence. The viral video of Kaiser's courthouse reaction had sparked a global movement that prison officials were struggling to contain. "Torres, you've got mail," announced Corrections Officer Janet Mitchell, wheeling a cart overflowing with letters, packages, and legal documents to Rachel's cell. "About 3,000 pieces today. We're running out of storage space." Rachel sat on her narrow cot, staring at the concrete wall where she'd scratched tiny marks, counting the days since her arrival. 47 marks. 47 days since she'd held Kaiser, since she'd felt the warmth of another living being who loved her unconditionally. Among the letters were some that brought tears to her eyes. A class of second graders from Ohio had sent drawings of police dogs with messages like, "Kaiser loves you," and "Dogs know the truth." Military veterans wrote about the sacred bond between handlers and their service animals. Police officers from across the country defying their department's orders sent anonymous letters expressing their belief in her innocence. But it was the updates about Kaiser that devastated her most completely. Dr. Emily Chun, the animal behaviorist who had been monitoring Kaiser's condition, sent weekly reports that Rachel read with a mixture of hope and despair. Kaiser had been moved from the police facility to a specialized animal sanctuary outside Detroit, where experts in trauma recovery for working dogs were trying desperately to save his life. Kaiser's condition continues to deteriorate. Dr. Chun's latest report stated he refuses food for days at a time, and when he does eat, it's barely enough to sustain basic bodily functions. His weight has dropped to 68 pounds, 22 pounds below his optimal weight. Most concerning is his complete withdrawal from human contact. He spends his days lying in the corner of his enclosure, staring in the direction of downtown Detroit as if waiting for someone who will never come. The sanctuary had tried everything. They brought in other police dogs to provide companionship, but Kaiser showed no interest. They played recordings of Rachel's voice, which only seemed to increase his agitation. Renowned dog trainers and animal psychologists worked with him daily, but nothing could reach him. He was dying of a broken heart, and everyone knew it. The global #KaiserKnows movement had evolved into something unprecedented in criminal justice history. Celebrity supporters included actors, musicians, athletes, and even some politicians willing to risk their careers for what they believed was right. Academy Award-winning actress Maria Gonzalez, herself a Latina who had grown up in Detroit, became the unofficial spokesperson for the movement. "This isn't just about one woman or one dog," Gonzalez said during an emotional appearance on 60 Minutes. "This is about the fundamental nature of truth and justice. Anyone who has ever loved a dog knows that they cannot be deceived by human manipulation. Kaiser's grief is evidence of Rachel's innocence, and we cannot allow the state to execute an innocent woman while her loyal partner dies of heartbreak." The movement had attracted some unusual supporters. Dr. Patricia Williams from Cornell University had assembled a team of the world's leading experts in canine behavior, and their collective analysis was damning to the prosecution's case. They published a detailed report stating that Kaiser's behavior was completely inconsistent with a handler guilty of violent crimes. Dogs have an evolutionary advantage in reading human emotional states, Dr. Williams explained to CNN's Anderson Cooper. They can detect changes in brain chemistry, stress hormones, and psychological patterns that humans cannot perceive. If Rachel Torres had committed murder, Kaiser would know it. His continued loyalty and grief prove her innocence more effectively than any polygraph test ever could. Meanwhile, inside the Huron Valley facility, Rachel was fighting her own battle for survival. Death row was designed to crush hope, and she felt its oppressive weight every day. The other inmates were mostly men who had committed unspeakable crimes, and their presence served as a constant reminder of where society had placed her. But Rachel found strength in unexpected places. She began corresponding with wrongfully convicted inmates who had been exonerated, learning about their experiences and drawing hope from their eventual freedom. She started teaching herself law, spending her limited library time researching appeals processes and studying cases similar to her own. Most importantly, she refused to let despair win. Every morning, she performed the same ritual. She would stand at her small window, face the direction where she knew Kaiser was staying, and whisper the same words. "I'm still here, boy. I'm still fighting. Don't give up on me." 3 months into her death row incarceration, Rachel received a visitor that changed everything. Sarah Chun, a former FBI agent turned private investigator, had seen the viral video, and something about Kaiser's reaction had bothered her. Chun's father had been a K-9 officer with the Chicago Police Department, and she understood the bond between handlers and their dogs better than most. "I've seen hundreds of police dogs over the years," Chun told Rachel during their first meeting in the visiting room. "I've never seen one react the way Kaiser did in that courtroom. Dogs don't lie, and they don't fake emotions. If you are guilty, he would know it." Chun had been investigating wrongful convictions for 12 years, and she had developed an instinct for cases that didn't feel right. The speed of Rachel's trial, the overwhelming evidence that seemed almost too perfect, the lack of any credible motive, it all pointed to a frame-up. "I want to take your case," Chun said, sliding a contract across the metal table. "Pro bono. I can't promise anything, but I believe you're innocent, and more importantly, I believe I can prove it." For the first time since her arrest, Rachel felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. But even as she signed the contract that might save her life, she knew that time was running out. Her execution date had been set for 8 months away, and with each passing day, Kaiser was fading further from the world. The race to save them both had begun, and the clock was ticking with merciless precision. Sarah Chun's investigation began with a simple but powerful question. If Rachel Torres was guilty of cold-blooded murder, why was her police dog dying of grief? Chun had spent 15 years with the FBI, 12 of those specializing in corruption cases, and she had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when something was wrong with a case. The viral video of Kaiser's courthouse reaction had haunted her for weeks, playing in her mind during sleepless nights until she finally decided to act. Chun's cramped office in downtown Detroit was a testament to her obsessive dedication to justice. The walls were covered with case files, crime scene photos, and flowcharts mapping corruption networks she'd exposed over the years. But now, dominating the center wall was everything she could find about Rachel Torres: crime scene photos, witness statements, evidence reports, and dozens of still frames from Kaiser's heartbreaking courthouse reaction. "Dogs don't lie," she muttered to herself as she studied the animal behaviorist reports for the 100th time. Her father, Sergeant Michael Chun of the Chicago PD, had worked with K-9 units for 25 years before his death from cancer 5 years earlier. From childhood, Sarah had understood that the bond between handler and dog was sacred, unbreakable, and impossible to fake. Chun's first breakthrough came when she noticed something others had missed: the timeline of Detective Mark Stevens' financial records. Using her FBI contacts and skills honed from years of following money trails, she discovered that Stevens had made several large cash deposits in the weeks leading up to Tony Vega's murder, deposits that coincided perfectly with major drug busts that had yielded unusually low seizures. "Interesting," Chun whispered, highlighting the dates on her computer screen. "Very interesting." But it was Stevens' purchasing habits that really caught her attention. 3 days after Rachel's arrest, Stevens had walked into a Mercedes dealership and paid cash for a $75,000 C-Class sedan for a detective making $68,000 annually. With known gambling debts and a recent divorce, this purchase should have been impossible. Chun drove to the dealership and spoke with the salesman who had handled the transaction, a nervous man named Jerry Kowalski, who remembered Stevens clearly. "Guy was weird," Kowalski said, glancing around to make sure his manager wasn't listening. "Came in with a duffel bag full of cash, mostly small bills. Said he'd been saving for years, but he seemed, I don't know, jumpy. Kept checking his phone, looking over his shoulder. And the cash smelled funny." "Funny how?" Chun pressed. "Like chemicals. You know that smell you get from certain drugs? My brother was an addict, so I recognized it. The money reeked of it." Chun's pulse quickened. Drug money was often contaminated with residue from the narcotics it had been stored with, creating a distinctive chemical odor that experienced law enforcement could recognize. Stevens hadn't just bought a Mercedes. With ill-gotten gains, he'd been careless enough to use money that could be traced back to drug operations. Her investigation into Stevens' background revealed even more troubling patterns. Chun discovered that Stevens had been present at over a dozen drug busts in the past year, where the seizures had been suspiciously low compared to intelligence estimates. She found witnesses who described seeing Stevens arrive at crime scenes before other officers, sometimes leaving with evidence bags that were never logged into the system. But the most damning evidence came from Stevens' own psychological profile. Chun accessed his personnel file through a contact in internal affairs and found a history of complaints that had been systematically buried. Female officers had reported unwanted advances. Suspects had complained about excessive force, and there were multiple allegations of evidence tampering that had never been properly investigated. The pattern was clear. Mark Stevens was a corrupt cop who had been flying under the radar for years, protected by a network of equally corrupt colleagues who benefited from his crimes. Chun's breakthrough with Captain Williams came through old-fashioned detective work. She followed him for 3 weeks, documenting his movements and discovering that he met regularly with known associates of the Morales cartel at a strip club called the Diamond Palace. Using long-range photography equipment, Chun captured images of Williams accepting briefcases from cartel members, briefcases that he never reported as evidence seizures. But Chun needed more than circumstantial evidence. She needed someone willing to talk, and that meant finding Stevens' weakness. Through careful research, she discovered that Stevens' ex-wife, Linda, had left him not just because of his gambling addiction, but because she had suspected his involvement in criminal activity. He came home with blood on his clothes sometimes. Linda Stevens told Chun during a secret meeting at a diner outside Detroit. When I asked about it, he said it was from suspects who resisted arrest. But Mark was always a liar, even when we were dating in high school. Linda revealed that Stevens had been physically abusive during their marriage, and that she had documentation of his violence hidden in a safety deposit box. More importantly, she had recordings of phone conversations where Stevens had discussed his criminal activities with unknown associates. I kept them for insurance, Linda explained, her hands shaking as she spoke. I knew someday he might try to hurt me or take my daughter away. I never thought they'd be evidence in a murder case. The recordings were explosive. In one conversation, Stevens could be heard discussing plans to eliminate the Torres problem and talking about framing someone for murder. In another, he bragged about how easy it was to manipulate evidence and fool internal affairs investigations. Meanwhile, Chun was fighting against time in more ways than one. Rachel's execution date was now just 5 months away, but equally urgent was Kaiser's deteriorating condition. Dr. Emily Chen, no relation, at the animal sanctuary sent increasingly desperate reports about the German Shepherd's declining health. Kaiser's vital signs are becoming critical, the veterinarian reported. His weight has dropped to 62 pounds, and he's showing signs of organ stress consistent with prolonged grief and malnutrition. We've tried every intervention possible, but he seems to be willing himself to die. If his condition doesn't improve in the next few weeks, we may lose him regardless of what happens with Rachel's case. Sarah Chun worked 18-hour days, fueled by coffee and determination. She knew that Kaiser's survival was somehow connected to Rachel's vindication. The dog was holding on, waiting for justice, but his body was failing. The viral video that had started Chun's investigation now served as a constant reminder of what was at stake. Not just an innocent woman's life, but the life of the loyal partner who refused to abandon her. As Chun gathered her evidence and prepared to confront Stevens with irrefutable proof of his crimes, she realized she was fighting for something larger than one wrongful conviction. She was fighting for the principle that truth would prevail over corruption, that loyalty would triumph over betrayal, and that sometimes the most important witness to justice walked on 4 legs and had never spoken a word. The confrontation that would change everything took place on a rain-soaked Thursday evening in the parking garage beneath Mark Stevens' apartment building. Sarah Chun had been watching him for days, waiting for the perfect moment when he would be alone and vulnerable. She knew that cornering a desperate, corrupt cop was dangerous, but with Rachel's execution, Now just 72 hours away, she was out of time and options. Stevens was walking to his Mercedes, fumbling with his keys and clearly intoxicated, when Chun stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. The former FBI agent had her service weapon drawn, but pointed at the ground, a show of force without escalation. "Hello, Mark," she said calmly. "We need to talk." Stevens spun around, his bloodshot eyes wide with surprise and fear. In the 3 months since Rachel's sentencing, he had deteriorated dramatically. The guilt and paranoia were eating him alive, manifesting in sleepless nights, excessive drinking, and a gambling addiction that had spiraled completely out of control. The Mercedes he'd bought with blood money was already being repossessed, and the loan sharks were closing in again. "Who the hell are you?" Stevens slurred, backing against his car. "I'm the person who's going to give you one last chance to do the right thing," Chun replied, pulling out a thick manila folder. "I know about the money, Mark. I know about the drug busts you've been skimming from. I know about Captain Williams and the Morales cartel. And I know you murdered Tony Vega and framed Rachel Torres." Stevens' face went white. "You're crazy. You don't know anything." Chun opened the folder and began laying out photographs on the hood of his car. Bank records showing the suspicious deposits. Photos of him meeting with cartel associates. The Mercedes purchase receipt. Testimony from witnesses who had seen him tampering with evidence. "Your ex-wife Linda was very helpful," Chun continued, her voice steady and professional. "Those recordings she made of your phone conversations were particularly interesting. The one where you discuss eliminating the Torres problem was especially compelling." Stevens stared at the evidence spread before him, his hands shaking. The careful facade he'd maintained for months was crumbling in real time. Linda ... That bitch recorded me? She was protecting herself and her daughter from a violent, corrupt cop, Chun said coldly. "Smart woman. But here's what's really going to destroy you. Mark, I've been tracking your movements for weeks. I know you've been meeting with federal prosecutors, trying to cut a deal about the cartel operation. But what you don't know is that they're already onto you. Williams flipped 2 days ago. This was a bluff, but Chun delivered it with such conviction that Stevens believed it completely. The detective's legs nearly gave out as the implications hit him. If Williams had confessed, then Stevens was facing not just exposure, but likely death at the hands of the cartel members he'd betrayed. "No," Stevens whispered. "Williams wouldn't ... He can't." "Oh, but he did," Chun pressed, stepping closer. "He told them everything. About how you murdered Tony Vega when he threatened to expose your operation. About how you planted Rachel's weapon at the scene. About how you coached witnesses and fabricated evidence. He threw you under the bus to save himself, just like you threw Rachel under the bus to save yourself." The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the concrete ceiling of the garage. Stevens slumped against his car, the weight of his crimes finally crushing him. For months, he had convinced himself that he was a victim of circumstances, that his corruption was justified by his financial desperation. But faced with the mountain of evidence and the reality of his betrayal by Williams, the delusion shattered. "I never meant for it to go this far," Stevens said, his voice barely audible. "It was supposed to be simple. Just skim a little money, here and there. But then Tony figured it out, and he was going to talk to the feds. So you killed him," Chun stated matter-of-factly. Stevens nodded slowly, tears mixing with rainwater on his face. "He was going to destroy everything. My career, my pension, my life. I panicked. When I shot him, it felt like someone else was pulling the trigger. And then you decided to frame Rachel because she was getting too close to the truth." "She was asking too many questions," Stevens continued, the words pouring out now like poison from an infected wound. "Her success rate with that damn dog was making the rest of us look bad. Internal Affairs was starting to notice the discrepancies. I needed someone to take the fall, and Rachel. She had rejected me, humiliated me in front of other officers. It felt like justice. Chun activated the recording device she'd hidden in her jacket pocket. Every word was being captured, creating the evidence that would finally free Rachel Torres. I planted her backup weapon at the scene, Stevens confessed, his voice growing stronger as the weight of secrecy lifted. I'd stolen it weeks earlier during a shift change. I practiced her signature until I could forge it perfectly. I created fake bank records showing drug money deposits. I coached Williams and other officers to lie about her behavior. And Tony. Vega was innocent? Tony was a small-time dealer who got in over his head. He was feeding information to the D, trying to work off his own charges. When he discovered our skimming operation, he threatened to expose us unless we cut him in. I couldn't let that happen. As Stevens continued his confession, something extraordinary was happening 40 miles away at the Peaceful Paws Animal Sanctuary. Kaiser, who had been lying motionless in his enclosure for days, suddenly lifted his head. Dr. Emily Chun, who was working late in her office, noticed the change immediately. "That's impossible," she whispered, watching through the security cameras as Kaiser stood up for the first time in a week. The German shepherd walked to his water bowl and drank deeply, then moved to his food dish and began eating with an appetite he hadn't shown in months. The timing was inexplicable from a scientific standpoint, but Dr. Chun had worked with animals long enough to know that some bonds transcended human understanding. Somehow, at the exact moment that Mark Stevens was confessing his crimes and clearing Rachel's name, Kaiser sensed that vindication was coming. His vital signs, which had been dangerously low for weeks, began to stabilize for the first time since Rachel's arrest. Back in the parking garage, Stevens had finished his confession, and Chun was already calling her contacts at the FBI. An hour, federal agents would arrest Stevens and begin the process of overturning Rachel's conviction. Within 6 hours, the governor would issue a stay of execution. And within 12 hours, the media would be broadcasting the news that would shock the world. Rachel Torres was innocent, and the loyal German shepherd, who had never stopped believing in her, had been right all along. The confession that started in a rain-soaked parking garage would ultimately rewrite the history of criminal justice, proving that sometimes the most important witness to truth walks on 4 legs and loves unconditionally. The morning of Rachel Torres's release dawned crisp and clear, as if the universe itself was celebrating the triumph of justice over corruption. After 547 days on death row for a crime she didn't commit, Rachel stood at the gates of Huron Valley Correctional Facility, free at last. The media circus was overwhelming. News trucks from every major network lined the road. Reporters shouted questions, and helicopters circled overhead. But Rachel had eyes for only one destination, the Peaceful Paws Animal Sanctuary, where Kaiser was waiting. The governor's emergency press conference 3 days earlier had sent shockwaves around the world. Standing beside Sarah Chun and playing Mark Stevens' recorded confession, Governor Patricia Hartman had announced not only Rachel's complete exoneration, but also the exposure of the largest police corruption scandal in Detroit's history. Stevens, Captain Williams, and 6 other officers were facing federal charges ranging from drug trafficking to murder. The city of Detroit had already announced a $15 million settlement for the wrongful conviction, but money meant nothing to Rachel compared to the reunion that awaited her. Rachel's mother, Maria Torres, was waiting outside the prison gates with tears streaming down her face. The 2 women embraced fiercely, 18 months of anguish and terror finally giving way to overwhelming relief. But even as reporters pressed forward with microphones and cameras, Rachel's focus remained singular. "I need to see Kaiser," she told the crowd of journalists. "He's been waiting for me, and I've been waiting for him. That's all that matters right now." The drive to the sanctuary, took 43 minutes through Detroit's morning traffic, with a police escort clearing the way. Rachel sat in the passenger seat of Sarah Chun's car, her hands trembling with anticipation. She had lost 35 pounds during her incarceration, her once vibrant appearance now gaunt and marked by the trauma of death row. But her eyes burned with purpose and love as they approached the sanctuary gates. Dr. Emily Chun met them at the entrance, her own eyes bright with tears. Over the past week, since Stephen's confession had been broadcast worldwide, Kaiser's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. The German shepherd who had been dying of heartbreak was suddenly eating regularly, taking walks around the sanctuary grounds, and showing interest in his surroundings for the first time in over a year. "He knows," Dr. Chun told Rachel as they walked toward Kaiser's enclosure. "I can't explain it scientifically, but somehow he knows you're coming home. His vital signs have normalized, his appetite has returned, and yesterday he actually played with a tennis ball for the first time since his arrival." The moment that would become the most watched video in internet history began when Rachel was still 50 yards away from Kaiser's enclosure. The German shepherd's head snapped up from where he'd been resting in the shade, his ears perked forward in that familiar alert position Rachel remembered so well. Then came the sound that made everyone present, reporters, sanctuary staff, and visitors, stop in their tracks. Kaiser's howl started low and melodic, building into a joyous song that seemed to contain every emotion he'd been holding inside for 547 days. It wasn't the mournful wail of grief they'd heard in the courthouse. This was pure, unbridled happiness, the sound of a soul recognizing its other half. "Kaiser," Rachel called out, her voice cracking with emotion. "I'm here, boy. I kept my promise." The moment Rachel spoke his name, Kaiser launched himself against the enclosure fence with such force that the entire structure shook. His powerful body pressed against the chain link, his paws reaching through the gaps, desperate to touch the woman he'd never stopped loving. Sanctuary workers fumbled with the gate locks, their hands shaking with the emotion of the moment. When the gate finally swung open, time seemed to slow down. Kaiser bounded toward Rachel with the fluid grace and power that had made him legendary on the police force. But now his strength was fueled by pure love rather than duty. Rachel dropped to her knees just as Kaiser reached her, and the impact of their reunion knocked her backward onto the grass. What happened next transcended the typical bond between human and animal. Kaiser's massive frame covered Rachel completely as he pressed his body against hers, his head buried in the crook of her neck. His entire body was trembling, not with fear or excitement, but with an emotional release so intense it seemed to shake his very soul. Rachel wrapped her arms around his neck, and both of them were crying Rachel with tears of joy and relief. Kaiser, with soft whimpers that spoke of months of loneliness, finally ended. "I know, baby," Rachel whispered into his fur, which had lost its luster during their separation, but was still familiar and comforting. "I know you waited for me. I know you never gave up. You saved my life, Kaiser. Your loyalty saved my life." Kaiser pulled back just enough to look into Rachel's eyes, and what the cameras captured in that moment would be analyzed by animal behaviorists for years to come. The German shepherd's amber eyes were bright with intelligence and unmistakable recognition. He placed his massive paw on Rachel's chest, directly over her heart, in a gesture so human and deliberate that witnesses gasped audibly. Then came the kisses, dozens of them, covering Rachel's face as Kaiser's tail wagged with such force his entire rear end swayed back and forth. The sound of his happiness was infectious. Sanctuary workers, reporters, and even hardened police officers found themselves laughing and crying simultaneously. The reunion lasted for over an hour, with Rachel and Kaiser simply holding each other in the grass while the world watched. Social media exploded with the hashtag #KaiserKnew all along, and the video garnered 100 million views in its first 24 hours. Online, animal shelters across the country reported record adoption rates as people, inspired by Kaiser's loyalty, sought to experience that unconditional love themselves. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Rachel and Kaiser finally stood up together. The German Shepherd positioned himself at Rachel's left side, his traditional working position, and looked up at her with absolute trust and devotion. After 547 days of separation, 547 days of heartbreak and injustice, they were partners again. As they walked away from the cameras and toward their new life together, Rachel whispered the words that would become the title of the book she would later write about their experience. Some bonds can't be broken. Some love can't be destroyed. And sometimes the greatest witness to truth walks on four legs and never says a word. Kaiser's loyalty had not only saved an innocent woman's life, it had proven that justice, no matter how delayed, would always find a way to triumph over corruption. Their story became a testament to the power of unconditional love and the unbreakable bond between souls who were meant to find each other, protect each other, and never let go.